Well, good morning, afternoon, good evening. I'm Merrill Norton, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the neurobiology of the brain development and addiction as we know it currently, 2011. So we're going to try to, I know some of you do not know this information, so I'm going to go very slowly and very deliberately. And if you have questions, please ask them. We'll try to see if we can have an answer for you, or sometimes I may not have an answer for you. But anyway, so we're going to talk about this. My background is that I have a doctorate in pharmacy, actually 2 of them. I have credentials in counseling. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Georgia College of Pharmacy. And for any reason that you may want to get in touch with me, please use my email, mnorton@rx.uga.edu. Okay, so let's talk about it. So we're going to see what we can do about the brain. I'd like to start off a little fun, all right, because I don't know when most people start using, but statistically in the country, the average age of first use is between 14 to 16. Now, it varies. So, guy says, when I was 5, everyone told me to be a big boy. When I was 10, they told me that I should be more mature. Now they say it's time to start acting like an adult. At this rate, I'll be eligible for Social Security before I graduate from high school. What this is about is everybody is seeking to be successful in a culture that demands that you have some sense of control, i.e. maturity. What I'm going to talk about is a major public health issue in our culture having to do with substance abuse and dependence that leads to people losing control. And they lose their lives, they end up in prisons, they lose their focus and their concentration on what they need to do for themselves. And it usually starts in adolescence. So I'm going to talk about adolescence a little bit, and then we're going to see how this develops. Now, my background is in psychopharmacology, so what I primarily focus on is the biochemistries of the brain. I have to, because my world, I have to manage almost 400 medications that are used in various ways, if it be addiction meds, psychiatric meds, pain management meds, those types of things. So when we talk about the chemistry, and I'll talk a little bit about the addiction depression of 2011, there is one big player that I won't talk a lot, but I want to introduce. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a protein. And it's important because it's the fertilizer that makes all the central nervous system nerve cells, neurons grow. You must have it. In the developmental brain, it's necessary for maturity. You go from 11-year-old, you go to 18-year-old, and then at 24 to 26, that's usually when this brain is fully mature. About 26 years old for males, 24 for females. And it's as a result of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor is responsible for short-term memory, long-term memory, all the types of academic, new learning, all of those things that we're required to have in this culture in order to be successful. I don't care if you're going to become a mechanic, go to do a technical trade, if you're going to be a professional, if you're going to be an athlete that knows how to do all the different types of plays, your brain-derived neurotrophic factor is what we got to have. We're finding out more and more about that because it's the fertilizer. The other part about it is there's another chemical called CAMP. CAMP is the energy that it takes for this brain to run. And it runs 24/7. We may be awake only 14 to 16 hours a day, but it's running, 24/7. And if it doesn't run, then there's things that happen. And one of the main things that happens when the CAMP is diminished is memory. And it creates memory not only in a conscious level, but also it creates what we call instinctual memory system alterations, where it changes how the biochemistry is developed and how it is produced. So you have to be aware of those 2 things too. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, what I say many times is that the teen brain resembles blueprints more than skyscrapers. Instead of thinking about a teen mind as an empty house that needs furnishing, understand it as a framing of a house that still needs walls, roof, wiring, and all of that. So as this brain evolves, even though it's physically mature around the age of 16, physically mature, it's still got lots of things that's got to go on with it in order for it to create an adult mind, an adult process. And that's around mid-20s. We may even think it may be even 28 in some areas. We still have gray matter that develops. So when you have this evolving brain, it's changing. So it's immature. For you that have children and you have an 8-year-old, they respond to you in one way, whereas you have a 14-year-old, they respond to you in another way, depending on lots of things. But that evolution is what we're trying to develop. And if we change that for any reason or for any kind of interruption, then we have problems. Now, there's two things that interrupt this brain chemistry development. Trauma. Now, the trauma can come from physical trauma, emotional trauma, sexual trauma, environmental trauma, anything that shocks the brain to stop for a millisecond. It can happen as simply as a child watching their pet dog get run over in the street. Or it can be something as powerful as 9/11. As y'all watched airplanes hit buildings, people died and those buildings collapsed. Or it can be violence in the home. It can be all these things. It shuts this system down, and that's a protective mechanism inside of the brain. The other thing that changes it is drugs of abuse. Alcohol, prescription drugs, marijuana, all kinds of things, depending on when they start to use, it begins to change this inner piece, this wiring, for instance. I want y'all to kind of keep the house in mind. Got to have a roof on it, it's got to have wiring, it's got to have all kinds of things. I'm having to redo a 150-year-old house as we speak. And I've got to rush out of here immediately because I got to meet with contractors to kind of get my house finished because I got a window that they didn't finish last night, and the rain came in, and guess what? Water came in on the floor. You understand? It's leaking. So we got to have all that fixed for it to work properly. Same way with the adolescent brain. Now, these are pictures of various brains, and this is the effect of extreme deprivation in infancy. This child suffers from emotional and cognitive problems. In other words, these are children that have been abandoned. Now, they have multiple studies. They have studies out of Europe. They have studies out of Asia. They have studies out of the U.S. And what happens, y'all, is as a result, parts of this brain doesn't fully engulf as a result of this emotional trauma. Now, it occurs. Nurturing, interaction, love, parenting, all these things is what really makes this brain evolve the way it needs to happen. But this brain here, and so when we started these studies, we see these temporal lobes here, which are the emotional, factual lobes of the brain. They make things work. They make it happen, And so anytime we have any kind of trauma, now listen to me, that's when we start having this reduction in activity in the temporal lobe. First thing that happens, and that affects short-term, long-term memory, new learning memory, and capabilities to do the thing that you've been taught, functionality-wise. If it be what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what rules I should follow, those kind of things. And so this is a result. Now, this doesn't have to do with substance of abuse, but what we will see is that as this brain may be developed, say a person has a normal brain, has a normal family background, has all these great things going on with it, and they decide they're going to go and start smoking meth or marijuana or drinking alcohol. But on a regular basis, what we see, there's a change from the normal brain to an abnormal brain. We'll talk a little more about that. So let's talk about what functions and why we're here. We have about 100 billion neurons, or nerve cells, and they work in two ways. They work electrically and they work chemically. So you got an electronic component to every nerve cell, and you got a chemical component to every nerve cell. It's kind of like your car. If you understand your car, you got an electrical system, turns on the air conditioner. Well, for the air conditioner, there's got to be a liquid in there called a coolant, and that coolant's got to work properly in order for you to feel cool air. You understand? Same way with the nervous system. So we got 100 billion of these. And they look like this. They have all kinds of components to them. They have an axon, and then they have Schwann cells, node of Revier, and all of these, and these cell bodies, and they're all connected to each other. So the thing about it is very complicated. In my world, it takes me about 3 weeks to explain all this in the classroom, to understand how all these work, because you have to know how these work, because every time you take a drug, I don't care if it's a prescription medication, over-the-counter medication, or substance of abuse, you change the way this neuron works. You change it, and so you have to be aware of what that's about. So here we have this 1 trillion pennies, like the neurons, and you see the size of it. It's huge. Comparatively speaking, could fill up a football field easily. But this is the size, if we was to measure these neurons out at size, this is what it would look like. This is how the brain is structured. Got a trillion of these things. So we got lots of neurons. And we have quadrillion connections. In other words, you got all these nerve cells and all these connections. I mean, quadrillion, I can't even imagine. And they're all firing at one time. Zing, bam, zing, zing, bam, bim, bam, ding, bam, bam, bam. And we got to have them firing all correctly at the same time in order for the world to make sense. We have to have them firing all at the same time for the world to make sense. And that's why infants have to be taken care of, because they don't have that capability. And 5-year-olds, if you're not careful, they'll run out in the street unattended and cause harm to themselves. And 11-year-olds can get into some serious trouble if they're left alone in the Walmart. You understand what I'm saying? Even 16-year-olds, when they're driving, they have to learn how to drive and have to be structured driving because they are not experienced drivers. You understand? That's what all this is about, is to improve these connections in order for them to become this mature, functioning brain. By adolescence, the brain has almost reached full size, and conventional wisdom had that all the adolescent brain was fully developed. Well, this is kind of what it looks like when you're born. At 6 years old, you have all these billions and billions of connections, and so by the time you're 14 years old, there's a process called pruning. The synapses and these neural pathways then become myelinated. In other words, they begin to be insulated. So let's say at 6 years old, you're in sports. You have a child in sports, and they play a little t-ball, and then they'll go play pee-wee football, and they may play soccer. You understand? They may play all of those. But as they get older and older, guess what? Those synapses begin, and then they begin to focus usually just on one, possibly 2 sports. And then as they evolve up into the professional sports, which I've had great experience with, they focus only on one. Why is that? Because that wire inside of that baseball neuron gets thickly and faster, and that way they can watch the ball and they can hit. As you all watch professional athletes, they get better and better even in their professional careers, to the point because this myelination goes on to about age 28. So the myelinization makes everything work, kind of like this. Now, so we laugh, but the anatomy of a teenager's brain is embarrassed by parents, section, ability to remember lyrics of an offensive hip-hop song, have no idea, cars, oh yeah, girls, that's for males, or oh boys, if it's female, schoolwork, smallest section of the brain, ability to listen. Remember, when you're training adolescents, what do you have to do? Remember my daughter, clean up your room, clean up your room, clean up your room, because she was she'd trash her room in a heartbeat, and she never would clean up. Didn't know how to wash clothes. So not only did I teach her how to clean up her room, I also taught her how to wash clothes. Well, that didn't really evolve until she moved out on her own and got her first place, because she still had a messy, when she was at UGA, she had a messy place, and she was still, but I still said, Kelly, this needs to look better than this. Clean up your room, those times. Didn't click till she got to be about 24, 25, so we all go to an apartment now, and guess what? She's got a spotless apartment. She knows how to wash clothes because you kept repeating these things over and over. That's kind of how these kids learn, because of the myelinization. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's how we learn to do new things. Very, very important. So the brains aren't finished yet. MRI scans, and I'll show you those in a minute, by Dr. Jay Gill of the National Institute of Mental Health, have revealed that rather than leaving childhood with a brain ready to take on responsibilities of a young adulthood, teens have to contend with a brain that is destroying old neural connections and building new ones. So here we have the conflict. In a normal brain, the brain is shutting down some connections and building new ones. Shutting down and building. So you have this conflict. So they have all these things. One day they'll come in and, I love you, mama. Next day, kiss my butt, mama. And you wonder why they're doing it. And it's because of this conflict of how this neural system is developing. And how long does it take to develop? 10 years. Normal development from 15 to 25 is 10 years. So you're going to have that without interruption. Without interruption. Now, what I'm going to tell you is, we're talking about substance abuse, so guess what happens? You start drinking on a regular basis, or smoking marijuana on a regular basis, or using cocaine or prescription drugs or whatever, guess what happens? All of this is interrupted. And it stops. developing. So people may start drinking at 16 and they may develop dependence by the time they're 20. And so they may be under the influence till they're 30. So when they start coming into treatment, guess what? They have the maturity level of a 15-year-old. You understand? Because that process never was completed. That's the problem here, y'all. That's the problem. Also, they lose memory capability, and we'll talk a little more about that. So here we go. Here comes the track, and you see you got a bright yellow brain here at 5 years old, and as it evolves, you want the blue. And so as this evolves down to the 5 and 7 and 8 and 12 and up to 20, you see this? This is what you want to have. This is the blue brain. This is this brain that's got these neural connections. It's got the right neurochemistry, and it's evolving. In other words, it's developing into an adult. But what happens when people start using is that, let's say they start using at this level, let's say they're 11 or 12 years old, and guess what? This part never happens if they use for a long enough period of time, and depending on what the drug is. So they freeze frame. They stay stuck. All right, so here's our brain. Age 11 is about 50% complete. Age 18, when they're graduating from high school, it's 75% complete. Age 24 to 34, it's 100%. That's your full tank brain. That's when you're humming like a sewing machine. That's when everything happens. Your career's going on. Usually when your family start, everything starts happening because you got all this energy. The good news is that's how it goes up on the upside. But on the downside, it starts diminishing. So at 44, it's now back down to 75%. Your body starts changing, y'all. And all of a sudden you become high risk for diabetes, metabolic syndromes, and all kinds of other things that you just didn't expect based on lots of factors. At 60, it's down to 50%. You understand? So what I tell people is you come in this world as children and you leave this world as children, biologically, and how the brain evolves. Now, so let's talk about addiction. All that's basic stuff about how the brain develops and how it needs to evolve, because it's going to get to a peak point. It's going to get to a peak point, and then guess what? Then it's going to naturally diminish in capability. By the time you're 60, where's my keys? What kind of blood pressure do you have, 60 versus 24? You understand? Lots of things begin. That's a natural process. Let's talk about what happens when people start using these psychoactive chemicals. It's called the hijacking, the new hijacking of the brain. So why do people use drugs? Anybody? Makes them feel good. Don't make me feel good. What else? Why else people use drugs?
Change the way we feel.
Change the way you feel? Why else?
Remove yourself from society.
Huh?
To remove yourself from society.
To remove yourself from society? Yeah.
Or fit into society.
Helps you fit into society, so there's issues of self-esteem and those kind of things. What else? Why else we use drugs in this culture?
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. What else?
False confidence.
False confidence. What else?
Makes me feel good. That's all I got.
We're a chemical culture. I'm a pharmacist. I'm very successful. I had lots of successful drugstores. And the reason why? You love drugs. There's advertisement and all that. In fact, most of y'all wouldn't even know what Cialis was unless it was for the TV. They never would have heard what Cialis was. There's a moment when I was washing dishes. Oh, my God. Such a touching moment. And then two people end up in a bathtub. What I'm saying is the pharmaceutical industry is very smart. It's because they teach you things they want you to buy. And so you learn about these medications. They've reduced the number of prescription medications to over-the-counter medications. We've got prescription antihistamines now that are over the counter because you demand it. You understand? And most of you have a way to pay for that. So it's a large industry. So let's talk about why we like uppers, downers, and all-arounders. The reward pathway in addiction. Natural rewards. Food, right? Water, right? Sex, right? And nurturing. Oh, God, we could spend hours on any of these about why people want to be loved and feel love and all the stuff having to do with sex and all the things, and look at all the food. I mean, that's another thing you sell a lot on television, right? All the food products. You can sit there and they'll show you a Whopper, and then they'll show you all kinds of chicken. And I mean, there's more stuff on TV that I even want to know about, food-wise. Why? It's because it makes us feel good when we have it, even temporarily, okay? Now, why does it make us feel good? Well, we start out with a natural 100% normally in the brain, and these are some studies that we've had several years ago. And we eat when we're hungry. That dopamine, and it's based on dopamine, which is that feel-good chemical in the brain, goes up to about 150%. And when it gets to 150%, then it stops, you feel satisfied, and guess what happens? Then it titrates down over several hours, and so this would be breakfast at 7 a.m., and it titrates down to, say, 12, 12:30. You're hungry again, guess what you're going to do? You're going to go eat again. That's how you survive. The brain wants you to survive, okay? If we talk about sex, and I don't talk about it often, but here you got sex that's sitting 100% in your hormone, and you have sexual activity, and you get up to an orgasm, then it goes up to about 200%. And everybody feels better because they've had that activity. So you got 150 for food, you got 200 for sex. These are the two greatest highs that we will experience naturally. Love, if you want to know love, about 175. But then love titrates down. It becomes a routine thing. You may be with your partner 10 years, and you may love your partner, but you know, did you tell them this morning, baby, you're the greatest thing ever happened to me. I love you. Did y'all do that? Probably not. If I was to do a survey out here on the street, probably not. Why? It's not that you don't love them. It's just it's become routine, and the brain is trying to save dopamine because dopamine is in very small quantities in the brain, very small quantities. So we got three areas of the brain that dopamine. Prefrontal cortex, it's what I call, I want a beer. And then they got a nucleus accumbens, which is an instinctual pathway, and it makes me feel good. And then we have a part of the instinctual pathway called the ventral tegmentum area, or the VTA, and that's the home of euphoric recall, and so it says Miller Lite. So a normal brain says, I want a beer, it makes me feel good, Miller Lite. Or it can be chocolate cake, be a redhead, be a fast car, it can be all kinds of things. You understand what I'm saying? That's normal. It goes this way. Normal. That's how you survive. That's how the brain is wired, okay? Here comes the dopamine. Dopamine, little star molecule sits here. It comes out of this vesicle, sits on the receptor. Receptor activates it, woo, makes me feel good. Makes me feel good. And it lasts for a few seconds. And then the brain then reabsorbs it, which is a part of the recycling, and takes it through a reuptake port. So what you have here is this dopamine cycling. Has to recycle everything, y'all. Has to recycle everything because we can't produce a lot of it, okay? And this happens starting when we're born till we die. So here we have cocaine. Let's talk about a 15-year-old decided he wants to experiment with cocaine. So what cocaine is, its molecular weight is about 3 times that of dopamine. See, I deal in the scientific world. Everything's got molecular weight. The molecules have certain weights, and they have to be certain. And so this receptor allows for this weight of this. But here comes a heavier molecule that is configured very similar to the dopamine. So what it simply does, it comes and inhibits or knocks this molecule of dopamine off the receptor, sits on the receptor, and it's heavier. So guess what? Instead of a normal orgasm lasting 2 to 3 seconds, a cocaine-induced orgasm can last 15 minutes with one experience. But then it's no more. It will never get that way again. It can be the pain relief from an opium-derived medication. It can be alcohol and how it reduces anxiety or how it makes people feel a part of or whatever it may be. Same thing happens, y'all. So there's a competitive piece to this disease component. This is a pathology of starting. This is what it normally does. This is what the brain would normally do. It is abnormal to have a molecule that size to start with, but it does, and so we have a culture that uses it, and so you have this cocaine. So, whoa, dog, it makes me feel good, and it mimics dopamine. You see what I'm saying? So as the brain uses more cocaine, it says 2 things. It deplenishes the dopamine that's already there, and it also stops producing the dopamine because it says, if you're going to take something from the outside, I'm going to stop producing it from the inside. And then what you have now is a phenomenon called tolerance. They begin to use more and drink more and do more. So here we have the drugs of choice and drugs of abuse. So here we got nicotine, which is a highly addicting substance. Why is it so addicting? It immediately goes up to 225. See, the magic mark with the percentage of dopamine that the brain can manage without going into an addictive process is around 200%. Just like I just told you. Why is that? It's because those natural highs are about no more than 200%. But here's smoking a cigarette. Look at here, 225. And then if you use morphine, and I'm a pain expert, I'm manage pain, and if I put it in a PCA pump and I calculate a loading dose, and then we're going to do a basal line and all the doses here, we're going to run about 200%. And if I do it enough, even though they click the clicker 50 times, they're only going to get 3 doses. And what we're going to do is, and they also have acute pain, that morphine is going to be managed so the more, as we titrate them off, they're not going to end up with an addiction to morphine. You understand? Because we're titrating it and we're dosing it accordingly. But what most people do here, the opiates, instead of taking one's good, 4 is much better. So when you take 4, then guess what? 200 plus 200 plus 200 plus 200, and now you're up to 600 to 800%, which leads to an addictive process. Again, the dopamine is being overstimulated. And here's cocaine we talked about. Snort some cocaine, or are you freebasing cocaine? 325%. 125%. That's 125% above a natural orgasm, which is the highest we can have. And then here's methamphetamine. It can go all the way up above 1 dose. Now what this does, y'all, is that balance that we were talking about, that involvement, depending on the adolescent, only has maybe 60% to start with, and you start overusing it like this, and guess what happens? It diminishes that dopamine very rapidly to the point that they have no dopamine. Now what happens when we don't have any dopamine? Look at this. We have food is about 50, sex is 100, so we measure those as naturals. Cocaine's 350 and meth maybe up to 1200. You understand? So what happens when we overstimulate that dopaminergic system? Well, first thing it is, there's a acute memory in the amygdala. It's the memory button in the instinctual brain. It is the memory button. So one thing that happens when you diminish dopamine is you become compulsive. See, you have to have enough dopamine in the brain to stop compulsivity. If you have appropriate dopamine, you're not compulsive. You're not impulsive. You understand what I'm saying? So you deplete that, so you become very impulsive, compulsive. So people, instead of taking 1 tablet or 2 tablets 4 times a day, how many often do they take it? 6, 8, 10 times a day. And as they progress into this process, it gets faster and faster. And they also create this vivid memory. So here we have a group of recovering cocaine addicts, let's say, and we show them a nature video, National Geographic. Let's talk about, if y'all have seen that one, the lions of the Serengeti. And we show them this lion, and this is pride, and they're raising cubs, and as one of the females had 3 cubs, and they spend 3 weeks carrying these 3 cubs around, and one of the cubs gets killed, and one gets caught over there by an alligator that is on an island, and they got to get back. And make a long story short, it's very boring. But for a cocaine addict, it doesn't stimulate any thoughts of using cocaine. But yet when I show a cocaine addict any kind of sensory having to do with cocaine, a cocaine video, guess what happened here? In that instinctual brain, a brain that they cannot control, they light up like a Christmas tree. And all they can remember is the greatest high they've ever had with that particular drug. The greatest high they've ever had. Now, y'all, when this occurs, we can't undo it. It is called, in the clinical world, preoccupation. It is where they think about the drug, even though they're not using the drug. And the more sensory activity they get around the drug, the more intense this goes, to the point that this thing lights up, and next thing you know, they're off to the races and they're using again. Now, how many of y'all tried to stop? Did it work? Why didn't it work?
Once it started, I couldn't quit.
Amygdala activation. Why else couldn't y'all quit? Even the deal y'all made. Y'all made a deal, didn't you? Y'all made all kinds of promises, didn't you? Deal. And how'd that make y'all feel when you couldn't control it?
Bad.
Lack of self-control.
Made you feel how bad?
Lack of self-control.
And what I'm trying to say is, in the world that we're trying to prevent, you can always have a brain like this as long as you don't use. But unfortunately, there's about 15% of our population, once they act, they will always be activated for the rest of their lives. That's why recovery is a lifelong experience. I can't cure this. I can slow it down. Got a couple of drugs that makes the intensity of the cravings. That's why we call it a disease process, y'all, because you change the biological components of the tracts inside of the brain. A lot of people have lots of interpretations, and they call it all kinds of things. This is instinctual. This is beyond anything that you know. In other words, this thing will light up as quickly as anything that you've ever seen, and it's relentless. It's 24/7. So, now, why is that? Well, in 2011, addiction is increasingly understood as a neurobiological illness with repetitive substance use corrupts the normal circuitry of the rewarding and adaptive behaviors caused by drug-induced neuroplastic changes. That is a scientific to say that once you change this brain, it's irreversible. And then what also happens, you will see this. In the path from substance abuse, which is the beginning, that's where there's control. Abuse is control. To addiction, where there's a loss of control, the neurochemistry shifts from dopamine, feel good, reward brain, I want a bear, makes me feel good, Miller Lite. That's reward brain. That's that good brain, that healthy brain, that evolving brain. Behavioral system to a predominantly glutamate base. Y'all know what glutamate is? It is a chemical responsible for pain. See, addicts are addicted to pain, not pleasure. Pain drives a train. And anything that bumps into that, any kind of stress whatsoever, I don't care if it's positive or negative, it triggers into that glutamate-based brain, that anti-reward brain, and guess what happens to them? You feel bad. Y'all not feeling real good about being here, are you? Hell no. Excuse me. No. What I'm trying to tell you is, it's like a salmon going upstream. It's very difficult. It's not fun. And so what happens, y'all, look at here. Glutamate, based one marked by dysregulated glutamate transmission from the prefrontal cortex nucleus accumbens relationship to the biological stimuli. This is called the anti-reward brain. Y'all know what the anti-reward brain is? All right, I'm going to tell you. It's called addiction. And what is addiction? Any type of stress that hits that brain, the first thing that's going to happen to you is there's going to be a Miller Lite. And then it's going to go over to the other part of that brain and it says, it makes me feel good. And then it's going to go up to your cognitive brain and it's going to say, I want a beer. Involuntarily. So y'all promised yourselves to quit, and you did. But the reason that it's not stopping, y'all, it's staying stopped. And the reason you don't and can't by yourselves stay stopped is because of this process. Now, science has generated much evidence showing that prolonged drug use changes the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. All right? Back to the adolescent brain. Here we go. Carbohydrate metabolism, which is that huge amount of energy that it takes to drive the brain. Carbohydrate is these sugars, natural sugars, and the components for that energy. So here is a 15-year-old male non-drinker, and this red area is evolving. By the time they're 24 to 26, it should be fully red. That's why you see the differences here. That's if there's no trauma, there's no mental illness, there's no history of substance use or abuse. That brain gets fully functional, which I just said earlier is what? In this culture, you must have a fully functioning brain in order to do what? Succeed. But what happens, y'all, is this is a 15-year-old male heavy drinker. What's happened to their carbohydrate metabolism? It has been shut down. So this brain goes on and graduates from Harvard. This brain doesn't make it out of high school. Now that's one type. Let me show you another type that I don't have the slide for, but let me explain it to you. There is genetic alcoholism. And there's several types, but I will talk about the type 2, which is the male only. Now what happens in this type that we've learned from Schuckett and his work and the geneticists is that the type 2 alcoholic brain looks like this before it drinks. And so this brain looks here, and so it's somewhat detached from the world. It's not quite a part of it. It doesn't seem to, it feels like it's abnormal. And the thing that happens is once they take their first drink, then this brain lights up like a Christmas tree. It becomes 100% brain within a matter of a few minutes. Very powerful experience, regardless of the age of when they do this first drinking. So powerful that they have a vivid first memory of their first drink, much more vivid than first memory of their first drink or use than any other activity that they have any other first about. And so this brain fills up very quickly, and the brain says, woo, dog! But then the brain very quickly says, uh-oh. And so what does it do? It starts to shut down these brains. So y'all, then we have the reason that most people say there's some alcoholics, some addicts that are functional addicts, because the brain helps them function better, helps them remember better, helps them because there's a huge deficit before they ever started to use. High risk. So if you got genetic histories of mental illness, addiction, trauma, or suicide, you're looking at this type of brain that could be changed almost instantly by the use of alcohol or other drugs. And we see a lot of kids that have ADHD, we have kids that have depression, we have kids that have high risk for some sort of surviving traumas, end up using as a result of trying to cope as a result of the damage that is caused by those. So we have this neurotransmitter transfer, and so we have dependence, and these are the 9 neurochemical families. We have a love chemical, we have a feel-good chemical, we have a pain chemical, we have a memory chemical, we have a bliss chemical, we have a pain relief chemical, we have an anxiety chemical, we have a sleep chemical, and we have a stimulant chemical here. And so you have dependence. What happens is, depending on what age and whatever, it diminishes what is present. And how long does that take? Depending on age of first use and drug, it can take less than 12 months to deplete the brain. Now people say, okay, that's bad news, so I'll give you the good news. How long does it take to recover? Well, people come to treatment. I'm working a treatment program, and we try to teach people how to recover, and we send them to all the different things. It's an adult program, and so what we try to do is teach them, why do you want to go to meetings, 90 meetings in 90 days? And they say, I don't go to meetings. I don't work them steps. I don't want to do all that stuff. You know, why? I don't care. I don't have a medication that's going to stop this, because what's going to happen for this brain has to be abstinent. And so what happens to the abstinence, years to replenish what has been taken away as a result of their use. They have to have 5 to 7 years abstinence before they break even. So what happens to them? They suffer anxiety disorders or depressive disorders, compulsive disorders, eating disorders, and other types of things as a result of this imbalance. So as they work hard and there's some balance. So that's why I'm a part of the psychiatric world, and some of them we have to use medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, anti-craving, all of these types of medications in order to help stabilize his imbalanced brain chemistry as a result of that. So addiction is a state of an organism engaged in a compulsive behaviors. Now I remember when I was at Emory with the Rhesus monkeys, and they had water and food and cocaine. And I don't recall Rhesus monkeys in nature being cocaine addicts. I don't know that I've seen that at National Geographic studies where you have a Rhesus monkey out there dealing cocaine to his other buddy, you know. I ain't seen that. I don't know if anybody has. Please send me some pictures. But the thing about it is, they would hit that cocaine button until they died. And that's what it is. It becomes a severely compulsive, impulsive disorder to death, premature death, years of death. Now, the behavior is reinforced. It's reinforcing, rewarding, or pleasurable. So they take the drug and, whoo, that makes me feel good. But then it takes more of the drug to feel good and more of the good to feel good, and then they substitute one drug for another, if you understand what I'm saying. And then eventually they lose, as a result of diminishment of dopamine, they lose control of limiting their intake. And this is what people struggle with. Well, I can just stop. And I keep saying stopping is not the issue. It's staying stopped. The purpose of the reason I'm doing this is to help parents and adolescents and young adults understand I have nothing once the process is in place to stop it except behavioral models And I must tell you that behavioral models are very difficult to learn. You have to go to treatment to learn what to do. And even when you're trying to learn what behavioral models to do, it's a struggle because you don't quite understand why I've got to do such and such or why I'm going to do such and such. I want to say it's a chronic disease state. It is not an acute disease state. It's not like getting over the flu. It is something that is there and it's there forever. And so one of the things we need to know is make sure that everybody has more education about this. I will say this about this one slide. The key element of addiction in the development is the development of a negative emotional state during abstinence. If I want to do a diagnostic of an individual, all I've got to do is look at their affect when they come in for an intake, or when they say they're 3 to 5 days sober, or they're 2 months sober. There's an overwhelming negative affect. In other words, it's a very abnormal state of being. There is no true happiness. There's no true joy. There's no true, I call it anhedonic. In other words, there's no pleasure in much of anything. That's because the brain is shifted from a dopamine-based brain to a glutamate-based brain, and that's where that brain stays. So how do they recover, y'all? How do they recover? Well, they got to learn about this. Their genetics may have a part. Their age of onset may have a part. The childhood trauma may have a part. Their learning disorders may have a part. Their mental illnesses may have a part. What they've got to learn, and what people have to learn, is one day at a time you change and you become a better person. In recovery, it's called spirituality. I'm not talking about religion or non-religion or whatever. I'm talking about spirituality. You got to do something that makes you feel better about you and how you interact with the world. Now, we're in a very, culturally, and this is my opinion as I've watched it psychologically, in a very narcissistic, stress-oriented culture at the moment. We're in a recession. People are losing their homes. They're losing their jobs. They got to find some relief somewhere. So what a lot of people do is seek it in alcohol and drugs. Now, some people will find other ways, but I find that we have an increase in this. And part of this has to do with this. Now, if there's an addiction risk, people end up with that. I have a lot of people don't have any genetic history, and they still end up in treatment. How's that? Well, it's because of the way the brain changes. Now, in adolescence, it's a period between the onset of puberty and the attainment of adult abilities. It occurs between childhood and young adult. This is where we see the percentage of the increase of use as a result of peer pressure, our culture. It's just a rite of passage, whatever. We still have, I still see the studies, and I don't know how accurate they are. They self-report studies. Some people claim 90%. I'm not real sure 90% of seniors have used some psychoactive chemical before graduating. I know there's a high percentage of people because people like to do it. Now, they come to college, they come in my world, oh, dog, we're going to have a very, questionable football season. But what do people do on Saturdays, game day? Oh, man, they get the barbecue out, and they roll down the thing, and they put the little tin up, and they have a little drink or two, and social use is great. I don't deal with people who socially use. I don't deal with people who even abuse. Only ones I deal with is ones lost control, but that's where it starts. Adolescence is where it starts. That's what we're trying to do here, is where it starts because of the immature brain. And so what, generally speaking, is that as people begin to drink, they change their thinking brain, their rational brain, so their plan changes, they change their boundaries or their inhibitions, they change their sensory. So what happens is their schooling may not become as important. The rules that they set up in the family may not be as important. The sense of safety. I have lots of adolescents and young adults and other adults that under the influence, they go do things that they probably wouldn't do sober. They end up, and they regret those things, most of them, as a result of that. And then we have a change in personality. Some become overly aggressive and violent, and some become isolated and antisocial. But the big deal here, y'all, is the learning. What happens and what I have problems with, even with folks in early treatment, is they don't remember anything. I cannot teach them. They're special ed students. They can't remember because you tell them something and they forget, and they forget. Why do they forget? Because they don't have the right chemistry that creates those memory banks. Now you change those memory banks, guess what? They may be changed. So I'm not real sure the perceptionable of new learning. And that has to do with being in the present. Being in the present is how you learn new things. But what happens is people learn when they're under the influence, guess what happens? The present perception disappears, and you're either in your past, most of them are in their future. So to learn something new is very, very difficult. And then here's the instinctual tracks. Here's where the food becomes less important, the thirst becomes less important, the sexuality becomes less important. And what happens, y'all, is they become very selfish, very narcissistic, and when I see them, most of the time they come into treatment, they're in what we call an instinctual fight or flight or freeze situation. What does that mean? Everybody wants to run away and hide. And if I say boo too loud with a new group, they all run, or they get scared, or they have a startle effect. And then you say something else, then they want to fight, and they'll just all of a sudden just break out and just all angry about blah, 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 blah. Or what I see a lot of them do, they freeze. They just get stuck and they don't move anywhere. And they don't know what to do. So we got to balance that, y'all. See, that's where that instinctual brain is imbalanced. So we got to do that. All right. So here you have all these developmental components. And the major problem here is all of these synapse receptors and blood flow, myelinization, metabolism, and volume all occur between the ages of starting about 12 up to about 24. Look at here, major problem. So if people start using during that time or before that time, guess what happens? All of the things that are necessary for normal brain chemistry are interrupted. And so what happens is they don't fully develop. And this is what their thinking brain is. See, here's the thinking brain. Here's the CEO. The brain thinking, the prefrontal cortex, it plans and does all the attention and judgment. And look at here. Response flexibility. That means they can be flexible and adapt and change and then foresee consequences. See, I got people in treatment that can't foresee consequences. Oh, I think I'm going out to the bar and be with my friend. I'm going to have a Coke. Okay. What does that mean? They don't understand that the smell of alcohol, the cue of alcohol could trigger that involuntary craving because they don't see the consequences. Now, if they could see the consequences, I'll tell you, I've treated 18,000 addicts in my career. All types of addicts. Percentage of recovery in ones are probably around 25% at most. Why don't they get the message? It's because the brain has been impacted so that they do not foresee the consequences of their next use. Major. And if it happens in adolescence, y'all, if it happens at 11 years old, guess what? This stops this process. They don't even have this process involved. So guess what? They don't even know that that's a part of being mature, is being able to foresee the consequences. So age of first use is right here. Frontal gray matter develops. Myelinization is responsible. You see all the myelinization here, where the 10 years it takes all of these all these areas of the brain that are necessary for memory and production in the sensory system, in the motor system, in the integrative system. You see all this? The break-in at about 20, 25 years old. And if you drink and use, all of that stops. And then I want to talk about OOPS. The anterior cingulate gyrus. Y'all know what the OOPS component of the brain is? OOPS. It's responsible for helping focus attention. It's like when you make a mistake, you learn from it. When the child touches a hot plate and burns their finger, what happens? Oops. Screams, hollers, and guess what the child usually learns? Don't touch the hot plate again. Now, when you're evolving, and also look at here, it's amazing is that it may involve the ability to empathize. In other words, empathy is where you care about self, others, and activities associated with those, and then undergoes high myelinization during adolescence. The OOPS center anticipates risk, detects those risks, and keeps us from making errors. What is the commonality of most of the addicts I've seen? They have a severely impaired OOPS system. Relapse is OOPS. Relapse has consequences. Relapse has things that should teach them, I will not use at any cost. But guess what happens to them? They have no involvement with the OOPS system and their compulsivity. So what happens is they relapse. And sometimes they relapse again and again. And unfortunately, they sometimes relapse until death. So that's why we're trying to teach this, is because once you change this, I have no medications. I have no biological capabilities. I'm very unaware of the psychotherapies, besides cognitive behavioral therapies, that may be able to intervene on this process. So we increase speed and efficiency, more regional specialization, limbic system involvement, higher than the frontal lobes, planning, self-control. All of that is a maturity as a part of this involvement of this brain. And then here come the drugs. Be alcohol, be cocaine, be the opioids, be ecstasy, be nicotine, be GHB, be PCP. And what happens, y'all, is a menagerie of the changes in all of these systems, neurologically, myelinization, biochemistry. And what happens here is this reward cascade changes, where this reward cascade, the first thing that you have to have is serotonin, which is a chemical responsible for all pleasure. As a result of use, they diminish this serotonin, so they have no pleasure in any natural event. The only way that they stimulate serotonin is by use of their chemical, and then as a result of that, they have drug-induced pleasures. And even with that, they lose capability to the point that it creates pain every time they drink or use. And again, because of these very complicated various areas. And this is Dr. Bloom's work back in the early 90s. So what we have, y'all, is what he calls the reward deficiency syndrome, that also can be related to personality disorders, other compulsive behaviors, addictive behaviors, and impulsive behaviors, such as these here. And so the thing about it is, this becomes a biological imbalance chemically that leads to all kinds of psychiatric disorders that are diagnosed or sometimes misdiagnosed as a result. So the last slide here, I guess the lesson is the brain becomes rewired. Normal brain, water, food, sex. Rewired brain, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, opioids, other drugs. So this is where it changes, y'all. And once it's changed, it's forever. Addiction is a chronic disease state. It is forever. The only way that we can help do this is to educate all of our children and all the people involved to be aware of the dangers. So if you're looking out here, and one of the things I want you to know about the rewiring is, make sure the first thing is look at genetic histories and look at your own children, adolescents' use and your own use, and make a decision about whether or not you'll be at high risk for developing this disease. Any questions?